A boy died 3 times, his heart stopped, his body went cold, and he slipped away. But each time he came back, he brought a terrifying message from Jesus about a darkness coming for us all. It was a normal Sunday in 1997. The family left church, happy and calm. Then, out of nowhere, an ambulance crashed into their car. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and their lives were changed forever. Let us dive into his words and uncover the warning he brought back. A child's journey beyond and back. Imagine dying 3 times and coming back with a message so chilling it could change everything we know about life and That's what happened to an 8-year-old boy who claimed to meet Jesus and see visions of a future drenched in darkness. His story isn't just extraordinary, it's downright haunting. But here's the twist. Before he fell silent, he spoke a name, one that could change everything. It all began on a seemingly normal Sunday in 1997. The family had just left church. The morning had been quiet and predictable, the kind of day that felt safe and ordinary. As they drove home, the roads were clear and their spirits were lifted. But in an instant, everything changed. At an intersection they'd driven through countless times, an ambulance, lights blazing and sirens screaming, tore through the crossing. The driver, caught in the urgency of saving a life, didn't see their car. The collision was catastrophic. Metal twisted and crumpled as glass shattered, scattering across the pavement. Their car spun violently before coming to a mangled stop. In seconds, a calm morning had turned into a nightmare. Greg died instantly. Linda, trapped in the wreckage, was critically injured. Their son, who had been in the back seat, showed no signs of life when paramedics arrived. The scene was chaotic, the kind that leaves even seasoned first responders shaken. He was rushed to the hospital, but his heart had already stopped. Clinically, he was dead. The hospital's emergency team worked tirelessly to bring him back. Against all odds, his heart started beating again, but this victory was short-lived. Hours later, his heart stopped once more, and then a third time. Each time, the medical team fought to revive him, pulling him back from the edge of But these moments came with a heavy price. The doctors warned Linda, who was now awake but grappling with her husband's that her son's brain had likely suffered severe damage. If he survived, he might never be the same. Linda refused to give up. She clung to hope, praying constantly as she sat by her son's bedside. Machines kept him alive, his body motionless in a coma. Days turned into weeks. The doctors saw no signs of improvement, but Linda's faith remained unshaken. She believed her son would return to her. Then one day, his eyes opened. The room erupted in stunned silence. Doctors and nurses froze, unsure if they could trust what they were seeing. Slowly he began to move, then to speak. His words, though weak, carried an unexplainable clarity. He didn't just come back to life, he came back with a story. He described leaving his body and entering a place filled with light, not the harsh, artificial kind, but a radiant, warm glow that felt alive. He spoke of fields that stretched endlessly and a peace so profound it felt as though nothing else mattered. But what struck everyone most was who he claimed to meet. In this glowing expanse, he encountered figures he instinctively knew. Some were relatives who had passed long before he was born. Among them were 2 children who stood out, their presence vivid and specific. He described them with startling detail, their curly hair, radiant smiles, and the warmth in their eyes. Linda froze as he spoke. These weren't just any children. They were the siblings she had lost to miscarriages, children her son had no way of knowing about. Her grief and disbelief mixed with wonder. How could this be possible? His story didn't end there. He described a meeting with Jesus, a presence so overwhelming in its love and light that it left him in tears. Jesus didn't use words to communicate. Instead, thoughts and feelings flowed directly into his mind, bypassing language altogether. Jesus showed him glimpses of a future, his future. He saw moments he hadn't yet lived, scenes of his life still to come. But amidst these visions was something darker. But his journey through this radiant realm wasn't entirely serene. At its edges, he sensed something cold and shadowy, a presence that lingered but never approached. He struggled to describe it, calling it a warning or a reminder of what could be. This darkness left him unsettled, a stark contrast to the warmth and peace he had experienced elsewhere. When he woke up in the hospital, his return wasn't gentle. He described the process as being yanked through a tunnel of light and sound, a disorienting rush back into his battered body. The fluorescent lights of the hospital were a harsh contrast to the glowing realm he had just left. But despite the trauma he had endured, he carried a calmness and clarity that seemed beyond his years. His recovery defied all expectations. The doctors, who had warned Linda of severe brain damage, were stunned. He retained his memories, his personality, and his cognitive abilities. In fact, there was something undeniably different about him. He spoke with a wisdom that seemed otherworldly, his words carrying a weight that left listeners captivated. His story spread quickly. Family, friends, and even strangers came to hear his account. Some were skeptical, dismissing it as a hallucination caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain. Others were moved to tears, finding solace and inspiration in his words. For Linda, his survival was nothing short of a miracle. After losing her husband, she had been given a second chance with her son, a chance she would never take for granted. As he grew, he continued to share his story, fulfilling the purpose he believed Jesus had given him. He spoke of hope and faith, urging others to find light even in the darkest times. His experience challenged the boundaries of what we understand about life and death, leaving a lasting impact on everyone who heard it. Charlie's journey wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. It was a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, there is a purpose and a reason to keep going. His story remains a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the mysteries that lie beyond the veil of life as we know it. It wasn't like the pictures Charlie had seen in Sunday school. It wasn't about flowing robes or soft light. Jesus' presence was something you felt in your bones, something that made the very air hum with meaning. Charlie felt no fear, no hesitation. Instead, he felt pulled in, like every fiber of his being was magnetized toward this overwhelming love. In those moments, time didn't seem to exist. Jesus didn't speak words, but the communication was undeniable, clear, and complete. Charlie's first sensation was one of reassurance. Every doubt, every fear, every shred of confusion melted away, replaced by an unshakable peace that wrapped around him like a warm blanket on a cold night. But the calm didn't last long. There was urgency in the atmosphere, a kind of pull that said, "Pay attention." What happened next would shape the rest of Charlie's life. Charlie was shown things, not like watching a movie, not like dreaming, but flashes, moments from the future. He saw himself older, making choices, encountering people he didn't yet know. There were challenges, moments that looked painful, but also glimmers of hope. He saw places he couldn't recognize and people whose faces were unfamiliar. But more than the what of these visions was the why. Charlie understood, without words, that these were things he needed to prepare for. This wasn't just a preview of life. It was a roadmap for his purpose. And then came the command. You have to go back. There was no bargaining, no negotiating. The decision wasn't his to make. Jesus' love was profound, all-encompassing, but it left no room for debate. This wasn't Charlie's time to stay. He had a mission to fulfill, a message to deliver, and a life to live. The understanding settled in him like a weight and a gift all at once. Charlie didn't want to leave. For all the peace and reassurance he felt, the thought of returning to the messiness of earth, to pain and doubt, was unbearable. He tried to cling to the place that felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever been. But Jesus was firm, not with words, but with a presence that radiated both authority and compassion. It's not your time, the presence seemed to say. And then, just as quickly as it began, one ordinary day was about to change their lives forever. The dark truths hidden in the past. The golden light was gone, replaced by a darkness that was heavy and consuming. He found himself standing in an endless void, unsure of where he was or how he had arrived. The warmth and peace of the ethereal realm had vanished, leaving behind a chill that seeped into his very being. Then, without warning, the void came alive. Images began to materialize around him, flickering like a broken film reel, each more vivid and overwhelming than the last. The first scene unfolded in a barren landscape filled with the sounds of clashing steel and anguished cries. Armies charged at one another, their faces twisted with rage and desperation. He could feel the ground shake beneath their feet, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. He wanted to look away but couldn't. Each fallen soldier, each shattered life seemed to echo within him, a reminder of the countless lives lost in humanity's pursuit of power and dominance. The scene shifted, and he was plunged into the chaos of a burning city. Flames roared through the streets, consuming everything in their path. Families huddled together, their faces streaked with soot and tears as they watched their homes crumble to ash. He felt their fear and helplessness as if it were his own. The cries of children, the anguished wails of mothers, and the hollow stares of fathers burned into his memory. It was a suffering so profound that it seemed to seep into the very fabric of time. As the visions continued, he was shown more of humanity's darkest moments. He saw the horrors of slavery, where men, women, and children were treated as property, stripped of their dignity and hope. He saw the atrocities of genocide, entire communities erased in acts of unspeakable cruelty. He witnessed famine and poverty, where countless lives were lost, not because of nature, but because of human greed and indifference. Each scene was a brutal reminder of the choices that had led humanity down such devastating paths. But it wasn't just the grand tragedies of history that he saw. He was shown smaller, quieter moments of pain. A child bullied in a schoolyard, an elderly man ignored and forgotten, a young woman crying alone in the darkness. These scenes were just as haunting, their simplicity making them all the more poignant. They were a reminder that the weight of human choices didn't always come from great events, but from the countless small actions that rippled through time, leaving scars on the world and its people. His heart grew heavier with each vision. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, a burden that seemed impossible to bear. It was as if he were being shown not just humanity's mistakes, but his very soul, raw and unfiltered. The pain, the anger, the fear, it was overwhelming, yet he couldn't turn away. He knew these were truths he needed to see, no matter how much they hurt. Then, amidst the darkness, a familiar light appeared. It was dim at first, a faint glimmer against the overwhelming shadow, but it grew steadily brighter. Jesus stood before him again, his presence both a comfort and a challenge. His eyes, filled with a sorrow that seemed infinite, met his, and he felt an overwhelming urge to weep. "This is what has been," the voice resonated deep and somber. "These are the choices humanity has made, the paths it has walked. Each act, no matter how small, ripples through time, shaping the world and its people." He wanted to speak, to ask why he was being shown these things, but the words wouldn't come. He felt paralyzed, trapped by the enormity of what he had witnessed. It was as if he were being asked to carry the weight of all humanity's sins, to bear them on his small, fragile shoulders. Jesus' gaze softened, though the sadness never left his eyes. "You see the weight of their choices, the pain they have caused, but do you see the hope that remains?" The boy blinked, confused. Hope? Amidst all this darkness? He searched the visions still swirling around him, desperate for a glimpse of light. At first he saw nothing but despair, but then, slowly, he began to notice the moments of kindness that had been hidden within the chaos. A soldier helping a wounded enemy to safety, a mother sacrificing her own meal so her child could eat, strangers coming together to rebuild a community after a disaster. They were small acts, fleeting and fragile, but they were there like tiny sparks in the darkness. Hope exists, Jesus said, his voice firm but gentle. But it is not enough to merely hope. Humanity must learn from its past, from its mistakes. Tell me, child, do you think they have? He hesitated. How could he answer such a question? The weight of what he had seen pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Humanity's history was a tapestry of contradictions, woven with threads of both cruelty and compassion. Could he truly say that people had learned, that they had changed? I don't know, he thought, though the words didn't leave his lips. His silence was answer enough. Jesus' expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, disappointment perhaps, or understanding. The path forward is not certain, he said, his tone heavy with meaning, but there is still time to choose differently, time to heal, time to love. The words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. Charlie felt a spark of something deep within him, a determination he hadn't known he possessed. He didn't understand why he had been chosen to see these things, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let the weight of humanity's past crush him. He had to believe in the possibility of redemption, even if it seemed impossibly far away. As the visions began to fade, Charlie felt a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. The darkness was still there, a shadow that would always linger, but so was the light. And in that light, he saw the potential for something better, a world where the mistakes of the past didn't have to define the future. The darkness returned, and Charlie's heart sank. He thought the worst had passed, but the void around him told a different story. This time, the images were sharper, closer, as if they were unfolding right before his eyes. The light that had once guided him now revealed a world he recognized, his own. Yet, what he saw wasn't the simple, peaceful life of Willow Creek. It was a stark and jarring vision of modern times, stripped of its facade to reveal an undercurrent of violence, greed, and ignorance. The first scene appeared like a vivid painting brought to life. Charlie stood in a bustling city, its towering skyscrapers reaching toward the heavens, yet casting long shadows over the streets below. He watched as people hurried past one another, their faces buried in glowing screens, oblivious to the world around them. A woman stumbled, dropping her belongings, but no one stopped to help. Cars honked impatiently, their drivers' tempers flaring. The air felt heavy, not from pollution, but from an overwhelming sense of disconnect and indifference. The scene shifted, and Charlie was now in a war-torn region. Smoke billowed into the sky, blotting out the sun. Buildings lay in ruins, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Soldiers marched through the rubble, their faces hardened by conflict. He saw children hiding in the shadows, their eyes wide with fear, clutching each other for comfort. The devastation was unrelenting, a reminder of the senseless violence that plagued so many parts of the world. Charlie's chest tightened as he felt the weight of their despair. As the visions continued, Charlie was shown the greed that consumed humanity. He stood in the middle of a sprawling corporate boardroom where men and women in expensive suits argued over profits. Their voices were loud, filled with self-interest, as they made decisions that would affect countless lives. He saw how resources were hoarded, how the rich grew richer, while the poor were left to suffer. The gap between those who had everything and those who had nothing was glaring, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. The next vision was quieter, but no less disturbing. Charlie was taken to hidden places, dimly lit rooms where things were exchanged and power was bartered. He saw politicians shaking hands with shadowy figures, their smiles masking intentions that reeked of corruption. Money changed hands, documents were signed, and promises were made, all in the name of control. These were the places where decisions were made, not for the good of the people, but for the benefit of the few. The web of lies and deceit was vast, stretching across borders and affecting lives in ways most would never know. Charlie's emotions churned as he watched. Anger, sadness, and confusion collided within him, each more intense than the last. He wanted to scream, to cry, to do something to stop what he was seeing, but he was powerless, a mere observer in this grim tableau. The weight of it all pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. He felt tears streaming down his face as the enormity of humanity's flaws consumed him. "Please," he whispered, though his voice barely carried in the void, "I can't take this anymore. Let me go back." The light returned, and with it the figure of Jesus. His presence was as commanding as before, but now it carried an edge of urgency. He stepped closer to Charlie, his eyes filled with both sorrow and resolve. "You must see," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You must understand what has been hidden, what festers in the hearts of men. Only then can you grasp the full scope of what must be done." Charlie's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. "Why?" he cried, his voice breaking. "Why do I have to see this? It's too much. I'm just a kid. I can't fix this." Jesus knelt before him, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You are not here to fix it, Charlie. You are here to witness, to carry this truth back with you, to share it. What you do with this knowledge is your choice, but you cannot turn away from it." The boy's sobs quieted, though his tears continued to fall. He felt the weight of Jesus' words settle over him, a burden he wasn't sure he could bear. But deep within, a flicker of determination began to grow. If he had been chosen to see these things, there had to be a reason. He couldn't let the darkness consume him. He had to find a way to carry the light back with him. The visions shifted again, this time to show acts of resistance and hope amidst the chaos. Charlie saw people standing up against injustice, risking everything to fight for what was right. He saw communities coming together to help those in need, strangers offering kindness in moments of despair. These acts were small compared to the scale of the problems, but they shone brightly in the darkness like stars in a moonless sky. Jesus rose, his figure towering yet gentle. "Remember what you have seen," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "The world is not beyond redemption, but it teeters on the edge. Humanity must choose its path. You have seen the worst it has to offer, but you have also seen its capacity for good. Carry this knowledge and let it guide you." Charlie nodded, though his heart still felt heavy. He didn't know how he could carry such a responsibility, but he understood that he had no choice. The visions had changed him, and there was no going back to who he had been before. As the light around him began to fade, he felt a sense of clarity amidst the confusion. The path ahead would be difficult, but it was one he had to walk. As we continue, Charlie's visions grow more intense, and the choices he must make will shape his future, a glimpse into a future we fear. The void gave way to a turbulent landscape. The air itself seemed alive, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle. Before him stretched a horizon unlike any he had seen. Dark clouds churned, blotting out the sun, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. This was not a vision of the past or the present. It was something far worse, a glimpse into a future steeped in fear and chaos. The first images unfolded in rapid succession. Towering waves crashed against once thriving coastal cities, swallowing them whole. He could almost hear the screams of people caught in the flood, their desperate cries muffled by the relentless roar of water. Fires raged through forests, turning them into barren wastelands. The air was thick with ash, and the earth beneath it cracked and crumbled, as if it too had given up. Then came the wars. Nations rose against one another, their weapons more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. Explosions lit up the sky, their fiery glow casting long shadows over the devastated land. Soldiers marched through desolate streets, their faces hardened and their hearts seemingly untouched by the destruction they left behind. Civilians cowered in fear, torn between fighting for survival and succumbing to despair. The scenes grew more personal, cutting deeper than the vast images of global destruction. Families were torn apart, their love replaced by suspicion and anger. Parents turned against children, siblings against one another, each driven by fear or greed. Communities that once stood together now crumbled under the weight of mistrust. People hoarded what little they had, their desperation blinding them to the needs of those around them. The vision shifted again, showing the consequences of humanity's choices. The earth itself seemed to rebel against its inhabitants. Crops withered in the fields, rivers ran dry, and once bustling cities became ghost towns. He saw people wandering aimlessly, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. Hunger and thirst drove them to acts of cruelty, each trying to take from the other in a bid to survive. The world had become a place of desolation, where hope was as scarce as the resources people fought over. His chest tightened as he watched. The weight of the images pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He wanted to scream, to look away, but the vision held him captive. Deep down, he knew he was being shown these things for a reason, though the purpose felt as distant as the horizon he stared at. As the chaos unfolded, a familiar presence appeared beside him. Jesus stood silently, his face a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The boy turned to him, desperation in his eyes. "Why?" he managed to whisper. "Why does it have to be like this?" Jesus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the scenes before them. "This is not what must be," he said, his voice steady and filled with gravity. "This is what will be if humanity continues down its current path. The choices they make today shape the world of tomorrow." The words hit hard. He turned back to the vision, his eyes searching for even the faintest glimmer of hope. Amid the darkness, he saw flashes, brief moments where people chose love over fear, compassion over greed. A woman shared her last piece of bread with a starving stranger. A group of neighbors rebuilt a home destroyed by fire. These acts were small, almost insignificant against the vastness of the destruction, but they were there. "They can choose differently," Jesus said, as if reading his thoughts, "but it will not be easy. Fear and greed are powerful forces, but so are love and faith. Humanity has the capacity for both. The question is which they will embrace." The vision began to shift, growing darker and more chaotic. Leaders stood before their people, their voices filled with promises of safety and prosperity, yet their actions betrayed them. Corruption spread like a disease, infecting every corner of society. Truth was twisted, turned into a weapon to divide rather than unite. His heart ached as he realized how deeply fear had rooted itself in the hearts of men. Jesus stepped closer, his presence grounding the boy amidst the chaos. "This is the warning," he said, his tone heavy with meaning. "What you see is not inevitable, but it is possible. Humanity's future is not yet written. It is a story they must write together, with every choice they make." He nodded, though the weight of what he had seen threatened to crush him. The images began to fade, leaving behind a silence that felt both oppressive and freeing. He turned to Jesus, his voice trembling. "What can I do? I'm just one person. How can I change any of this?" Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder, his gaze steady and filled with compassion. "You cannot change the world alone, but you can be a light in the darkness. You can choose love even when it is hard. You can remind others of the power they hold within themselves. Change begins not with nations, but with individuals." The words settled over him like a balm, soothing the raw edges of his fear. He didn't fully understand how he could carry such a burden, but he knew he had to try. The future he had seen was terrifying, but it wasn't set in stone. There was still time to choose differently, to create a world where love and compassion triumphed over fear and greed. As the light around him began to fade, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But he also felt a spark of hope, a belief that even the smallest actions could ripple outward, creating waves of change. And in that hope, he found the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The light dimmed, and the weight of the visions he had witnessed seemed to settle deeper into his bones. He stood in a space that felt both infinite and confined, the silence pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. Jesus stood before him, his expression solemn. There was no comfort in his gaze this time, only an unyielding truth that could be felt in every fiber of his being. "You have seen what has been, what is, and what could be," Jesus began, his voice carrying the gravity of 1,000 storms. "But there is more you must understand." His heart sank. He wasn't sure he could take anymore. Every vision had chipped away at the innocence he once carried, replacing it with a crushing awareness of humanity's flaws. Yet he knew he had no choice but to listen. Jesus' presence demanded it. "Most will not listen," Jesus said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "They will see the signs, hear the warnings, and still turn away. They will choose ignorance, comfort, and greed over the truth. And because of this, the consequences will be severe." As he spoke, the space around him transformed. He found himself standing in a barren wasteland, the air thick with smoke and ash. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and lifeless, stretching endlessly in every direction. In the distance, he could see figures moving aimlessly, their forms gaunt and shadowed. They were neither alive nor dead, caught in a torment that defied comprehension. "This is what awaits those who continue to choose darkness," Jesus said, his tone unyielding, "not as punishment from above, but as the natural result of their choices. The world will break under the weight of their greed and apathy, and they will break with it." His eyes filled with tears as he took in the horrifying scene. He could feel the despair emanating from the wandering figures, their suffering a palpable force in the air. This was no ordinary pain. It was the kind that came from within, a punishment born of regret and realization too late. The vision shifted again, and Charlie was now in a city consumed by chaos. Fires raged in the streets, and the sound of breaking glass and distant screams filled the air. People fought over scraps of food, their faces twisted with desperation and rage. He saw families torn apart, their love replaced by suspicion and anger. The division was absolute, the darkness complete. Jesus' voice broke through the cacophony. "This is the path humanity has chosen, and this is where it will lead. But it is not too late. There is still a chance to turn back, to choose differently. But that choice must come soon." Charlie turned to Jesus, his voice trembling. "What can I do? I'm just a kid. How can I change any of this?" Jesus' gaze softened, though the sorrow in his eyes remained. "You are not alone, Charlie. You carry a light within you, as does every person, but most have forgotten how to let it shine. Your task is to remind them, show them what you have seen, tell them what you have learned. It will not be easy, and many will not listen, but even one spark can ignite a flame." The space around them shifted once more, and Charlie found himself standing on the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast, dark ocean. The water churned violently, its waves crashing against jagged rocks below. It was a stark and unwelcoming sight, yet something about it felt final, as if it represented the culmination of all he had been shown. Jesus placed a hand on Charlie's shoulder, his touch both grounding and electrifying. "The burden I place upon you is great, but so is the potential within you. You must return to the world and share what you have seen. Speak the truth, even when it is hard. Shine your light, even when the darkness feels overwhelming, for it is in the darkest moments that light is needed most." Charlie nodded, though his heart felt heavy with the weight of the task ahead. He didn't know how he would do it, but he understood that he had no choice. The images he had seen, the truths he had learned, were too powerful to keep to himself. If there was even a chance to change the course of humanity, he had to try. "Will they listen?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jesus' expression was unreadable as he answered, "Some will, many will not, but that is not for you to decide. Your task is to plant the seeds. Whether they grow is up to them." The light around them began to shift, growing brighter as the scenes of desolation faded. Charlie felt a warmth returning, a faint reminder of the peace he had felt at the beginning of this path. Yet, He knew that peace would not last. The world he was returning to was far from perfect, and the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. As the brightness enveloped him, Jesus' voice echoed in his mind. Go now, Charlie. Carry the truth with you. And remember, even in the face of darkness, there is always hope. With those final words, the light consumed him, and Charlie felt himself falling, not in fear, but in surrender. He didn't know where he would land, but he knew his purpose now. The horrifying message he carried wasn't just a burden, it was a call to action, a chance to change the world before it was too late. Charlie sees a frightening future ahead, carrying the weight of the truth as he moves forward on his path. A miracle boy faces reality. The light began to shift again, but this time it wasn't leading to another vision or revelation. Instead, it started to pull away, unraveling like threads from a tapestry. He felt the warmth receding, replaced by a growing emptiness that made his chest ache. Panic set in as he realized what was happening. He was being sent back. No, he cried, his voice trembling with desperation. Please don't send me back. I want to stay here. It's peaceful here. I'm safe here. Jesus stood before him, his expression both compassionate and resolute. Your time here is not yet, he said, his voice firm but kind. There is much for you to do in the world you came from. Your path there is not finished. He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I can't. It's too hard. The things I saw, I can't face them. Please, let me stay. Jesus knelt down, his gaze steady and filled with understanding. I know you are afraid, but the strength you need is already within you. You have seen the darkness, yes, but you have also seen the light. Remember that. Carry it with you. It will guide you. Before he could protest further, the light around him grew blinding, and he felt himself falling. It wasn't the peaceful drift he had experienced earlier, but a forceful, almost jarring descent. The warmth and serenity of the realm he had been in were gone, replaced by a cold, heavy sensation that enveloped him entirely. The next thing he knew, his eyes fluttered open, and the sterile, white ceiling of the hospital came into view. The beeping of monitors and the hushed voices of nurses filled his ears, grounding him in the reality he had left behind. His body felt foreign, heavy and sluggish, as if he were trying to move through water. Pain flickered in the edges of his awareness, but it was dull compared to the weight in his chest. Charlie, a voice gasped, breaking through the haze. He turned his head slowly to see his mother, Linda, sitting at his bedside. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying, but the moment she saw his open eyes, her expression shifted to one of pure disbelief and joy. Oh my God, you're awake. She called for the doctors, her voice trembling with emotion. Within moments, the room was filled with people, nurses, doctors, and his father, Greg, who stumbled into the room as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He's awake, Greg whispered, his voice breaking. He's really awake. The medical staff quickly surrounded him, checking his vitals and murmuring in amazement. They spoke of miracles and unexplainable recoveries, their scientific reasoning failing to account for what had happened. All he could do was lie there, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile the serene realm he had just left with the chaos of the hospital room. Linda clung to his hand, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers of gratitude. Greg stood nearby, his hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, the weight of their relief and joy made his chest tighten. He had been given back to them, and they didn't even know how close he had come to staying away forever. As the hours passed and the initial shock subsided, he found himself retreating inward. He listened as his parents and the doctors spoke in hushed tones, but their words barely registered. His mind was consumed by the visions he had seen and the task he had been given. How could he explain any of it? Would they even believe him if he tried? When Linda finally asked, her voice soft and tentative, "What happened, sweetheart? Do you remember anything?" He hesitated, The weight of the truth felt too heavy to share, especially in that moment. He shook his head slowly, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know," he mumbled. "It's all blurry." His mother nodded, her relief palpable. "That's okay, honey. You don't have to remember right now. We're just so glad you're here." But he did remember. He remembered everything. The light, the visions, the voice of Jesus, and the horrifying truths he had been shown. The burden of that knowledge weighed heavily on him, making him feel older and more fragile than he ever had before. He wanted to tell someone, to unburden himself, but fear held him back. What if they thought he was crazy? What if they dismissed it as a dream or a hallucination? Over the next few days, as his body grew stronger and the color returned to his cheeks, he remained quiet about his experience. His parents chalked up his silence to the trauma of the accident, but he knew better. He wasn't ready to share what he had seen. Not yet. The world felt too loud, too overwhelming, and he needed time to process it all. Late at night, when the hospital was quiet and the lights were dim, he would close his eyes and try to recapture the feeling of the peaceful realm. He would replay Jesus' words in his mind, trying to find strength in them. "You are not alone," he had said. "Carry the light within you." But even those words couldn't erase the fear that lingered in his heart. He knew he had a purpose now, a task that seemed impossibly large for a 10-year-old boy. And yet, he also knew that he couldn't ignore it. The light within him might have been small, but it was there, waiting to grow. All he had to do was find the courage to let it shine. The hospital room was quiet except for the faint hum of machines. He sat up in his bed, his small frame propped against a mountain of pillows. For days, he had wrestled with the weight of his experience, the visions of light and darkness, and the mission placed on his shoulders. He had tried to keep it to himself, to hold on to the peace of silence, but the burden was growing too heavy to bear alone. "Mom, Dad," he said softly one evening, his voice trembling. Linda and Greg, seated nearby, immediately turned their attention to him, their faces filled with concern and love. "There's something I need to tell you." They exchanged a glance, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and worry. "What is it, sweetheart?" Linda asked, leaning closer. He hesitated, his hands gripping the blanket tightly. He took a deep breath, summoning all the courage he could muster. "When I was gone, I saw things. I was in a place filled with light, and I met Jesus. He showed me things about the world, things about what's happening, and what could happen if we don't change." The room fell silent. Linda's eyes widened, her hand instinctively reaching for Greg's. Greg's brow furrowed, his mouth opening as if to say something, but closing again. The weight of the words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. "Are you sure it wasn't a dream?" Greg finally asked, his voice gentle but skeptical. "You went through so much, buddy. It's normal for your mind to create things when—" "It wasn't a dream," he interrupted, his voice firm despite the tremble. "It was real. I saw things, terrible things, but also hope. He told me I had to share it, that people needed to know." Linda's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to stroke his hair. "We believe you, honey," she whispered, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "We just want to understand." Over the next few days, Charlie began sharing more of his story, piece by piece. He told his parents about the visions of humanity's darkest moments, the warnings of what could come, and the glimpses of hope that remained. Linda listened intently, her face a canvas of emotions, while Greg nodded, though his skepticism lingered. The weight of Charlie's words was impossible to ignore, even if they were hard to fully grasp. Word of Charlie's return began to spread throughout the small town of Willow Creek. At first, it was just whispers among neighbors and friends, but soon the story reached the local church. The pastor, a kind-hearted man named Reverend Thompson, visited Charlie in the hospital, eager to hear his account. Sitting by the boy's bedside, He listened with rapt attention as Charlie recounted his path. "God works in strange ways," Reverend Thompson said after Charlie finished. "Your story is a powerful one, Charlie. Perhaps it's meant to inspire others to reflect and change." Encouraged by the pastor's support, Charlie agreed to speak at the next Sunday service. The thought terrified him, but he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. When the day arrived, the church was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and even some strangers who had heard about the miracle boy. Charlie stood at the front, his knees shaking as he began to speak. He told them about the light, the visions of destruction, and the hope that remained if humanity chose love and compassion over fear and greed. His voice wavered at first, but as he spoke, a calm strength took over. The congregation sat in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the small boy delivering such a profound message. When he finished, the reactions were mixed. Some people approached him with tears in their eyes, thanking him for sharing his experience and promising to reflect on their own lives. Others whispered among themselves, their skepticism clear. "Poor kid," one man said under his breath. "He's been through so much. Of course he's imagining things." The mixed reactions didn't stop there. As word of Charlie's story spread beyond Willow Creek, media outlets began to take notice. Reporters showed up at the hospital, their cameras and microphones creating a commotion that made Charlie feel small and overwhelmed. They bombarded him with questions, twisting his words and sensationalizing his account. "Miracle Boy claims to see the end of the world," one headline read. "10-year-old's vision, a warning from beyond," read another. The attention was suffocating. Charlie felt like his story, his truth, was being turned into a spectacle. Strangers flooded the hospital with letters and gifts, some praising him as a prophet, while others accused him of being a fraud. The weight of it all pressed down on him, making him question whether he should have spoken out at all. Linda and Greg did their best to shield him from the chaos, but even they couldn't stop the tide of attention. "You don't have to do this, Charlie," Greg said one evening as they watched a news segment about him. "If it's too much, we can tell them to leave you alone." But Charlie shook his head. "I have to," he said quietly, "even if they don't believe me, even if it's hard. He told me I had to share it. I can't stop now." Despite the pressure and the doubts, Charlie continued to speak. He shared his story with anyone who would listen, neighbors, reporters, even skeptics. Each time he hoped that his words would plant a seed, that they would inspire someone to choose kindness and compassion. And though the reactions remained mixed, he held on to the belief that his message was reaching those who needed to hear it. Late at night, when the world was quiet and the weight of his task felt unbearable, Charlie would close his eyes and remember the light. He would replay Jesus' words in his mind, finding strength in them. "Carry the light within you," he had said, and Charlie knew he would, no matter how heavy the burden became. Now, Charlie faces the results of sharing his story and the chaos that follows while his message begins to spread. The ripple effect of one boy's message. The world was not ready for Charlie's message. As his story spread, it created ripples that turned into waves, dividing communities, families, and even nations. Some listened with open hearts, their lives changed by the boy's account of light and darkness, hope and despair. They saw his story as a wake-up call, a chance to reflect on their own actions and choose a better path. Churches filled with people seeking guidance, neighbors reached out to one another in kindness, and movements for compassion and justice sprang up in unexpected places. But for every person inspired by Charlie's words, there was another who dismissed them outright. "It's a child's imagination," skeptics argued, their voices loud and scornful. "A tragic accident and a vivid dream, nothing more." On television and social media, debates raged. Experts dissected his story. Psychologists theorized about trauma-induced visions, and commentators mocked the prophet child for his naivety. The more Charlie's message spread, the more polarized the world became. The boy had become a symbol of hope to some, of delusion to others. For Charlie, the division was both heartbreaking and overwhelming. He hadn't asked for this responsibility, yet he couldn't ignore it. The things he had seen, The truths he carried were too urgent to stay silent about, but the weight of it all was immense. The media's relentless scrutiny, the judgment from strangers, and even the doubts whispered by people he once trusted made him feel like a tiny ship lost in a stormy sea. Still, he found strength in the message he had been given. Charlie's faith, once simple and childlike, had deepened into something unshakable. He spent hours reflecting on the visions, praying for guidance, and finding solace in the quiet moments when he could still feel the faint warmth of the light he had known. Those moments reminded him why he couldn't give up, even when the world seemed intent on tearing him down. As months turned into years, Charlie's life changed in ways he never imagined. He was no longer just a boy from Willow Creek. He was a figure people looked to for inspiration or derision. Invitations poured in from around the world to speak at conferences, to share his story with leaders and communities, to appear on global platforms. Each time he stepped onto a stage or faced a camera, his heart pounded with nerves, but he pushed through, driven by the knowledge that his words could make a difference. The more he spoke, the more he realized that the message wasn't just about warning people of what might come. It was about urging them to see the choices they made every day, the small acts of kindness or cruelty, the moments of compassion or indifference. Every choice matters, he would say, his voice steady despite the weight of the world on his shoulders. The future isn't set in stone. It's being written right now by each of us. Some days were harder than others. The ridicule and backlash never fully went away, and Charlie often felt like he was shouting into a void. But then there were the moments that reminded him why he couldn't stop. A letter from a stranger who had chosen to forgive someone after hearing his story. A small town that started a community garden to share food with those in need. A child who told him they wanted to grow up and help the world, just like you. The impact of Charlie's message rippled outward, but the divisions it revealed only seemed to deepen. In some places, people united in a shared desire to create a better world. In others, fear and greed tightened their grip, driving wedges between friends and families. Political leaders used his story as a tool, some embracing it to push for change, while others weaponized it to sow distrust and gain power. Despite the chaos around him, Charlie's resolve never wavered. He had seen the worst humanity could become, but he had also seen its potential for greatness. Those glimmers of hope, no matter how small, were enough to keep him going. And so he continued to speak, to urge people to choose love over hate, compassion over indifference. One evening, standing before a crowd of thousands at a gathering in a bustling city, Charlie delivered what would become his most powerful speech. His voice, though still young, carried the weight of someone far older. "I didn't ask for this," he began, his words echoing through the quiet crowd. "I didn't ask to see the things I saw or to carry this message, but I was given it for a reason, and I believe that reason is you." He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "I saw a world divided, a world consumed by fear and greed, but I also saw hope. I saw people choosing to help instead of harm, to build instead of destroy. Those choices, those moments are what will decide our future. Not me, not some grand miracle. Us, together." The crowd erupted into applause, some moved to tears, others standing in silent solidarity. Charlie's plea resonated deeply, and in that moment, it felt as if the world might truly listen. But the story didn't end there. For every step forward, there were setbacks. For every heart changed, there were those who refused to hear. The battle for humanity's future was far from over, and Charlie knew it wasn't one he could fight alone. Still, he carried on, planting seeds of hope wherever he went. As the years passed, the world began to change, though slowly and unevenly. Charlie's message became a spark for movements that challenged greed, corruption, and division. Some of those movements succeeded, creating pockets of light in the darkness. Others struggled, their efforts stifled by the very forces they sought to overcome. But through it all, the echoes of his words remained. In his final public appearance, now a young man, but still carrying the same unwavering faith, Charlie stood before a crowd and offered one last plea. "The choice is yours," he said simply. "It has always been yours. But remember this, even the smallest light can pierce the greatest darkness. Choose to be that light." The story closed with an open ending, the final chapter unwritten. The boy who had once been burdened with a message he didn't ask for had become a symbol of hope and resilience. Whether humanity heeded his words remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. His message had sparked something real, something that could grow into a force for change. The rest was up to them. Is Charlie's message truly a warning from heaven, or could it be something darker, something beyond our understanding? Could his story be a glimpse into something we're not meant to know? Tell us your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.